host broadcaster of the G20 South Africa 2025.
All right, here's for G20 focus. Africa's food security agenda is expected to take an important stage at this year's Group of 20 Leaders Summit, taking place in a couple of weeks here in Johannesburg, South Africa. Recently, the Group of 20 Africa outreach meeting on industrialization and agriculture was held in Abuja, Nigeria, focusing on enhancing industrial development and agricultural practices across the continent under the theme, Boosting Africa's Agricultural and Industrial Transformation. To tell us more about how South Africa's G20 presidency will boost Africa's agenda, we're joined virtually by Ben Joubert, the Acting Chief Director at the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. He's also the G20 Sherpa Track Coordinator for South Africa. Mr. Joubert, a very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. Welcome.
Good morning, Sipiwe. Good morning to you all.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Now, the meeting in Abuja in Nigeria brought together leaders, policymakers, stakeholders to discuss the strategies for sustainable growth, investment opportunities, collaboration amongst other G20 countries and African nations. So what were some of the key objectives there?
Yes, so I think for us as the G20 presidency this year, South Africa had several objectives. First of all, it is to give effect to the statement and the undertaking of our president to make the G20 presidency a African one. So for us, the outreach in Abuja, just like the outreach in Cairo and the upcoming one in Ethiopia, were to give effect to that promise of our president. But for us, it's also about a continued discussion on the issues that are important for Africa, especially in this case, food security and the elements thereof, like industrialization in the agricultural sector. So it was a continued discussion. It was a reminder of what is important to Africa. And it was, of course, a very useful policy debate on what are the elements in industrialization, the gaps in financing, the gaps in infrastructure that we need to continue to address to make Africa a truly a continent of prosperity and one that delivers to its communities the issues that are important, in this case, food security.
And just considering that it's the first time that the G20 Leaders Summit is being held in the African continent, how are the G20 Africa outreach meetings being used to influence Africa's G20 policy decisions?
Well, I think the most important thing here is to be cognizant of the fact that our presidency takes the AU, the African Union, as a member of the G20, their priorities into our presidency. So overall, the big strategies for the continent, like Agenda 2063 and the elements thereof, like the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, are incorporated into the agenda, and therefore you can see that continental issues are incorporated into global platforms like the G20. So for us, that's basically the approach. And when we get to summit, you will see those elements playing out in the declaration, in our leaders' declaration. So that's how we play it, and that's more or less how we work on consensus. And I must confess that if I look at the amount of support we do get from our G20 members, from the invited countries to our presidency, from the international organizations, there's a lot of support for South Africa's presidency and for our focus on the continent, of course.
And just considering the outpouring of support that South Africa has in terms of hosting this, and taking into cognizance that the G20 was never originally, structured with Africa in mind, let's talk about some of the structural or political barriers that still exist in aligning some of the G20 priorities with Africa's development realities.
I think for us it is. There's not so much barriers as a commitment to having the G20 let's call it the G20 ecosystem, understanding Africa's needs. And I think the shifts are there, the shifts are evident. If you look at how the AU came on board as a G20 member in 2023 during India's chairship, presidency of the G20, and how Brazil has continued that focus, not only on, let's call it developing countries or the South, but also specifically Africa. There are, the only barrier that there would be is a lack of will from our side as G20 members and as the developing bloc in the G20 to promote an understanding of the continent's needs. And that is why you see in our presidency the focus on issues like food security, even AI, with a focus of AI and innovations contribution to sustainable development. And of course, the main issue, one of the major issues, an understanding of debt sustainability and how it negatively impacts, or how debt, the burden of debt and the cost of debt negatively impacts on our developmental goals. So it's about an effort to ensure that there is an understanding for these issues in the G20 community and on a platform of that size on the global arena, on the global stage.
Yeah, you know, Mr. Joubert, in your view, does Africa's growing visibility within the G20 community translate into influence, or are we still fighting in a place or in a space where, you know, power is still unevenly distributed?
I would like to believe that the efforts that we put out do help to put visibility, to increase visibility for Africa in the G20 platform. But I think it is very challenging scenario. You know, the geopolitical scenario in the world is a very challenging one. There's competing interests and competing forces that take us away from the attention and the good intentions we have to promote Africa as such. So I do think that there is an impact. I do think it needs a sustainable and continued effort. And I do believe that, well, for South Africa, Africa is part of our foreign policy focus. So we would like to believe that what we're doing this year in our presidency for Africa will have a significant longevity in the G20 process. So we will see what we are achieving this year playing out in future presidencies of the G20. Yes.
And in us understanding how we could harness that longevity in the G20 processes, maybe we could talk about the most persistent policy bottlenecks that have historically undermined Africa's self-sufficiency in food production, and how this particular G20 cycle aims to tackle them differently.
Well, I do believe it's not a policy issue as such. Maybe there are policy bottlenecks. I'm not an expert on that. But I think what is perhaps we have the policies. The issue is implementation. You know, implementation needs focus. It needs funding. It needs infrastructure funding. There are many issues in this process. Apart from perhaps a policy bottleneck or two, there is the willingness in Africa. Africa's policymakers have, with the help of the international community, with the help of the multilateral system, developed excellent policies in food security. If you look at the work that is done by the FAO, by the UN agencies, other UN agencies, and in the broadest sense, you know, when it comes to food security or any of these issues, it talks to a lot of things. It's agriculture, it is climate change, it is gender issues that impact on them. But I think our main challenge is implementing those excellent policies we have. And in Abuja, this came out actually very, very strongly, also very well articulated by the Nigerian ministers who attended our event. Yes.
Okay, Mr. Joubert, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Well, that was Ben Joubert, the Acting Chief Director at the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. He's also the G20 Sherpa Track Coordinator for South Africa, talking to us about the outcomes of the recent G20 Africa outreach meeting on industrialization and as well as agriculture held recently in Abuja in Nigeria and on Africa's G20 agenda.